when the Vice President of the United States blamed black leaders for America's collapse. He thought no one would dare challenge him. But what happened next in a packed room in Dallas stunned the entire country. It was the kind of day that felt heavy even before the storm clouds rolled in thick air, clung to skin, and something unspoken pulsed beneath the surface of the city. The town hall was meant to be simple, a scheduled appearance by the Vice President of the United States J.D. Vance in Atlanta to discuss crime, jobs, and education. A crowd gathered, local officials, church leaders, reporters, folding chairs arranged in neat rows. A polite buzz of conversation and cameras blinking red quietly in the back. People did not come expecting a fire. They came for policy, they came for presence, they came maybe for hope, but instead they got something else entirely. When J.D. Vance stepped to the podium, he looked calm, confident, practiced in the way that men in power often are. He adjusted his tie, glanced briefly at his notes, and began with broad strokes of language. About national decline, about broken systems, about failed cities. Then came the turn. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowered not in anger but in precision, and said that the real crisis was leadership, or rather the lack of it. And then the sentence that cracked the air: for too long, he said, black leaders have failed their communities. They have used the language of struggle to cover for corruption. They have chased victimhood while their neighborhoods fall apart. The words hit the room like cold steel, not shouted, not accidental, but deliberate, polished, carved, and left to hang in the air like smoke. Some shifted in their seats, others stared ahead, blinking as if waiting for a retraction that would never come. A murmur rose, a ripple of disbelief. One man stood and left quietly, his chair creaking in the silence. Some nodded yes. There were always a few, and others clenched their fists silently, holding back the weight of generations and histories pressed into a single moment, a single phrase delivered from behind the safety of power. And in the second row, Jasmine Crockett did not move, her face still, her eyes locked. She had heard these words before, not these exact ones, but the rhythm, the undertone, the message hidden beneath the language of reform. The same old song about personal responsibility, dressed up in the suit of a national address. She stayed seated, stayed still, but inside, the weight pressed against her chest, not just for herself but for her grandfather, who had picked cotton in East Texas, for her mother, who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on for her constituents, who were told every year that they just needed to try harder while policies stripped their schools, their clinics, their safety, their voice around her. The room cracked into fragments. Some tried to defend the vice president, others whispered in anger and disbelief, but Crockett stayed quiet, and that silence was not surrender, it was preparation. She left without a word, slipping past the press, slipping past the aides, who had already begun drafting statements to clean it all up. She did not need to scream, not yet, because she knew something. They did not. She knew what was coming across the country. The quote spread not as outrage but as warning, a sign that the language was shifting again, that blame would now be dressed in policy, that the cruelty would come with a grin. It wasn't just the speech, it was the pattern, it was what came before it and what would come next. Bills proposed in quiet committees, funding cuts masked as reform, a narrative forming, one where black leadership would be scapegoated while the machinery of inequality kept spinning quietly in the background. But Crockett had seen that machinery up close. She had stood inside its gears and felt its pressure, and she knew it could be broken, but not with silence. That night in her office, the lights lowered, the sky cracking with thunder, she pulled out the old photo of her grandfather, thin, tired eyes staring back from a jail mugshot, arrested for stealing food during a summer where his family had nothing and no one came to help. The system did not ask why, it only punished and labeled and walked away. She traced the edges of the photo for a long time before placing it beside her notes, because this was not about one speech, it was about the lie behind it, the lie that America's failure was personal and not systemic, the lie that the oppressed were always to blame for the wound inflicted upon them. In Atlanta, the rain came hard, washing the streets clean, but the words could not be rinsed away, and neither could what was coming, because Jasmine Crockett was not going to forget, and she was not going to let the country forget either. And when she finally spoke, they would feel it. This moment was never just about politics, it was never just about a soundbite or a headline, or even the insult itself. It was about something deeper, older, more dangerous than most people were willing to admit. When J.D. Vance stood behind that podium and pointed the finger not at policy, not at power, not at systems, but at black leadership, he was reaching into a playbook that had been used for generations. It was familiar, calculated, and it always worked the same way. Tell people they are not being held back. Tell them they are simply being failed by their own. Tell them the reason they are struggling is because of someone who looks like them and not the institutions that built the struggle itself. This is the old American switchblade, polished and passed down through centuries, sharpened not with violence but with rhetoric, the kind that sounds respectable, the kind that smiles while it blames the victim, the kind that turns pain into proof and survival into shame. And this time, it came not from a fringe voice but from the Vice President of the United States, second only to a president whose name was already synonymous with division and control. This was not an accident, this was not a slip, this was a message sent loud and clear to a country already straining under the weight of inequality. Jasmine Crockett knew that message well because she had lived it before, not just in Congress, Not just in law school but in childhood, in church basements, in classrooms with too many kids and not enough books, in grocery stores where the shelves were empty and the stairs were full of judgment. She had seen how narratives become weapons, how people in power shape the stories of those without it and then use those stories to justify silence. The words J.D. Vance spoke were wrapped in concern, but they were soaked in contempt, because to blame black leaders was to ignore the truth that this country had set them up to fail from the beginning. It was to ignore that entire cities were built on redlining, that schools were underfunded by design, that healthcare deserts were created on purpose, and that for every black mayor or council member who stepped into office, they were already handed a house that had been set on fire decades ago and told to save it with a single glass of water. Crockett knew this because she had been that woman, handed the glass, handed the speech, handed the expectation to be perfect in a world that had already decided she was the problem before she ever said a word. Now J.D. Vance had spoken not just to the crowd in Atlanta but to millions watching, and he had declared that the rot was not in the foundation but in the people themselves, and that was not just a lie, it was an act of political violence. It was a dangerous distortion that erased the work, the struggle, the small wins fought for in courtrooms and committee rooms and kitchen tables late at night by people who knew they would never be celebrated but who did the work anyway. To say that black leaders were the reason for decline was to erase the legacy of men and women who spent their lives pushing uphill against every obstacle thrown their way. It was to take all that pain and effort and turn it into a footnote in someone else's speech, and, more than anything, it was a signal that this administration was not here to fix the system. It was here to protect it, to double down, to blame the oppressed for the oppression, to say quietly and calmly that the problem was not injustice but the people trying to name it. Jasmine Crockett felt that weight, and she knew this was not just about her district. It was not just about one town hall. It was about every single black girl who had ever been told she was too loud, every single black boy who had been taught to shrink himself, every single mother who had cried in silence because the world kept closing in no matter how hard she worked. This was about a pattern that stretched back through time: the plantation, the poll tax, the prison cell, the underfunded school, the police stop, the media narrative, the political talking point, and now the vice presidential podium. This was about survival being spun into failure, and it was about the cruelty of watching someone use your own struggle as proof that you were unfit to lead. That was the deeper issue, not just leadership, but whose leadership was allowed to matter, whose leadership was seen as legitimate, and whose was always doubted from the start, because what J.D. Vance said was not a critique, it was a disqualification, and it was meant to sow doubt, not just in the minds of voters but in the hearts of those who dared to run, dared to rise, dared to speak. It was meant to make black leadership seem like an experiment that had failed rather than a resistance that had stand. That was the heart of it: the power to define truth, the power to narrate history while it was still happening, the power to shape how people saw themselves and each other. That was what Crockett felt pressing against her chest as she prepared to speak, not just the insult but the centuries packed behind it, because she was not just defending herself, she was defending a lineage, a legacy, a labor that had been mocked and misunderstood for far too long, and she would not let that lie go unanswered. 3 days passed between the speech and the response, and in those 3 days the country twisted itself into a knot of questions and fire. The clip of J.D. Vance spread like heat, not because it was loud but because it was familiar. It touched something raw in the bones of people who had heard this before in quieter ways, in boardrooms and school meetings and news articles, and on the lips of neighbors who swore they were just being honest. But this was the vice president. This was not muttered at the dinner table or whispered in a private conversation. This was said on a stage beneath the flag, with cameras watching and people listening, and it was said with the confidence of someone who expected no real challenge, because that is how this has always worked. Powerful men speak and the rest are expected to either nod or disappear. But Jasmine Crockett was not built for silence. She never had been, not when she watched her mother break her back to keep the lights on, not when she studied law by the hum of cheap fluorescent bulbs, not when she walked into rooms full of men who looked her up and down and dismissed her before she even opened her mouth. So when she heard what J.D. Vance had said, she did not rush to respond. She waited. She let the country feel the weight of his words, and then she prepared. Not a rebuttal, not a press release, not a tweet, but a message, something that would not just clap back but cut deep, something that would reach beyond the moment and remind people exactly what was at stake. The event was scheduled in Dallas, her home turf, packed with familiar faces and strangers alike. No fancy slogans, no polished branding, just a podium, a microphone, and a woman ready to speak her truth without permission and without fear. The room buzzed with a low hum of electricity. People knew something was coming, something real, not manufactured or rehearsed, but honest and sharpened. When she walked out the room, still, she did not raise her voice right away. She stood in stillness, looked out across the crowd, and then she began. "Mr. Vice President," she said, "you want to talk about failure? Then let us talk about the systems that failed long before any of us were elected. Let us talk about what happens when you grow up in a zip code that the government wrote off, when your schools are falling apart, when the closest hospitals shut down 10 years ago, when your streets are patrolled but never protected." She paused, let the silence stretch wide, and then she held Up a photo, black and white edges frayed, a mugshot of her grandfather barely older than a teenager, his eyes hollow but proud, his hands cuffed, his posture defiant. This is the man. Your words erased, she said, arrested for stealing food in a town that would rather let him starve than let him survive. This is the face of what you call failure, but I call it what it was: hunger, desperation, and a country that had no mercy for black boys who needed help. The room did not erupt, it tightened like a fist. Everyone listening now, not just with ears but with memory, with muscle, with blood, that remembered too much. You want to blame black leadership, she said. Fine, but let us be clear. We were never handed a level field. We were handed rubble and asked to build cities from it. We were handed broken budgets, abandoned schools, no safety nets, no allies, and we still showed up, we still fought, and you have the nerve to call us the problem. Her voice rose now, not in rage but in clarity, the kind that comes from knowing the truth so fully that it no longer fits inside the body. You do not get to stand in front of this country and rewrite the story. You do not get to say we failed when you never let us lead without shackles. She turned, then looked directly into the camera as if she were looking through it, into every living room, into every place where someone had heard Vance's words and felt the sting, felt the shame creeping in, and she spoke to them too. Do not let them lie to you. Do not let them turn your pain into proof that you are broken. Do not let them take your struggle and turn it into a weapon against you. And then she stopped, not because she was finished, but because enough had been said. The silence that followed was thick, not the kind of silence that comes from confusion, but the kind that comes from impact, from weight, from truth that cannot be dismissed. It was not just a response. It was a reckoning. It was a refusal to let the story be stolen again, and in that moment everything shifted. The vice president had used his platform to assign blame. She had used hers to tell the truth, and the difference between the two rang louder than anything she could have screamed later. They would say it was one of the most powerful moments of the year, that something had broken open in the country that day, and maybe it had. Maybe it was a crack in the wall that had held for far too long. But in that moment it was not about history or headlines. It was about a woman standing tall in the face of power and saying, not this time, not again, not while I have breath in my lungs. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do in the face of power is to simply tell the truth out loud and let the silence speak for itself. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in this country is not what is said, but who is allowed to say it and who is expected to stay quiet. J.D. Vance said what many have thought for years. He just had the podium to say it out loud. He said it with calm certainty, as if it were fact, as if it had always been true that black leaders were the reason for American decline. But what is decline, and who gets to define itis decline when a child grows up in a neighborhood with no fresh food and no working streetlights? Is it when a mother has to choose between paying rent or getting her medicine? Is it when a school is forced to shut down because funding was diverted to build a prison to counties over? Is it when politicians sit behind gold-plated desks and tell people to work harder while knowing the system was never designed for them to win? And if that is what decline looks like, then maybe the people we should be questioning are not the ones trying to fix it with broken tools. Maybe the real failure is not in black leadership, but in the very idea that leadership can only be valid if it follows the rules written by those who never lived at the bottom. Jasmine Crockett did not speak for herself alone. She spoke for the people who are always talked about but rarely talk to, the people who are blamed without being heard, the people who get told to calm down, to be civil, to wait their turn as if history ever gave them one. She stood and said enough, and in doing so reminded everyone watching that power is not always about title or office. It is about truth and who has the courage to carry it into the light. This country has a long memory but a short conscience. It remembers who to punish it, remembers who to shame it, remembers the parts of the story that keep certain people in charge, but it forgets the wounds it caused. It forgets the policies that created poverty, the decisions that forced generations to start life already 10 steps behind. And then when someone like J.D. Vance looks around and sees struggle, he points to the people carrying that weight and calls them the cause instead of the consequence. That it is not leadership, that is deflection, that is not truth, that is cowardice dressed up as courage. So now the question is not what he said or even what Jasmine said in return. The question is what we are going to do with the truth laid bare in front of us. Are we going to keep pretending that injustice is accidental, or are we going to name it for what it is? Are we going to keep demanding perfection from the oppressed while making excuses for the powerful? Are we going to let this moment pass like all the others, or are we finally going to listen not just to the voices that speak loudest but to the ones that speak from the fire? Because Crockett's voice did not rise for applause. It rose for memory, for legacy, for justice. For every name and every face and every story erased by the lie that pain is proof of failure. And now it is on us to carry that forward, not just in politics, not just in speeches, but in how we treat each other, in how we talk about each other, in what we are willing to challenge and what we are no longer willing to excuse. Because this was never just about one man's words or one woman's answer. This was about the fight for who gets to be seen as a leader in this country and who is always seen as a problem to solve. And that fight is far from over. So ask yourself, who are you listening to? Who are you standing beside? Whose story do you believe? Because silence is a choice, and so is truth, and the truth is rising whether power is ready or not.